Smoke rose from the pit, thick and sweet with the smell of hickory. A row of German women in faded POW uniforms stood frozen beside a split-rail fence, their faces half lit by the Texas sun. Across from them, men in wide-brimmed hats and dusty jeans waved them closer, shouting over the crackle of the fire, "Come on, ladies, you're our guests tonight." The women exchanged uncertain glances. Guests? They had expected punishment, not invitation. The one called Lotta hesitated, the memory of bombed-out Dresden flashing behind her eyes. But then a cowboy handed her a plate heavy with smoked brisket and beans, smiling like this was the most natural thing in the world. The smell alone broke her composure. As the first bite touched her lips, she blinked back tears. Kindness, again, from enemies. Around her, laughter rose with the sound of country music and clinking tin cups. It wasn't just food, it was disbelief, sizzling in the Texas dusk. The memory of smoke lingered long after the night faded, curling through the dawn air like a half-remembered dream. When the German women first arrived at the Texas prisoner of war camp, they thought the haze on the horizon was from fires, not from ranches. Their train had clattered across miles of sunburnt land, the windows clouded with dust that coated their tongues and lashes. The war had ended weeks before, but the surrender had not yet settled in their bones. They were still soldiers without weapons, women who had manned radios and typed orders for an empire that no longer existed. The desert wind stung their faces as the train doors opened, and the world that greeted them was too vast to comprehend, an ocean of heat and silence. No gunfire, no rubble, no ruins, just sky, endless and indifferent. Their boots crunched against the gravel as American guards ushered them into line. The smell of mesquite wood drifted from somewhere beyond the fences, faint and sweet. For a moment, it made one of the women, Lotta, think of home. Her father used to burn oak in the small stove during winters in Dresden when the streets were still whole. But this scent was different, wilder. It carried laughter, not survival. She turned her face away, blinking back tears that surprised her. They expected shouting. Commands barked in a foreign tongue, the language of victors and vengeance. Instead, the guards spoke evenly, with an odd softness that unsettled them more than cruelty could have. One man, tall and tanned, wore a Stetson tilted back on his head. His rifle hung loosely at his side. When he saw one of the women stumble, he reached for a canteen and held it out without a word. She stared at it like it might explode. He only smiled faintly, gesturing for her to drink. The water was cool, clean, absurdly gentle against a throat still dry from the Atlantic voyage. The women exchanged wary glances. Were they being mocked? Was this a trick to lower their guard? The man in the hat said something, his accent thick, his tone patient, and though they didn't understand the words, the kindness was unmistakable. Another guard, younger, offered bread. Real bread, soft and white. One of the women refused, clutching her ration tin like a relic. Another took a hesitant bite and flinched as if expecting pain. None came. Only the heavy taste of flour and salt. They were marched toward the barracks, wooden structures lined neatly like toy houses against the horizon. The barbed wire fences shimmered in the sunlight, but beyond them the world stretched wide and alive. Horses grazed lazily on the far side of the pasture, tails flicking against flies. A group of cowhands rode by, their laughter carried on the wind. The Germans stopped to watch, transfixed. It was a picture that made no sense. War was supposed to end in punishment, not in postcard scenery. Lotta couldn't take her eyes off the cattle, Their slow movements, the easy rhythm of creatures that knew nothing of surrender, stirred something painful in her chest. The sight was almost cruel in its beauty. Freedom was so close she could smell it, dust and grass, leather and sweat, and yet it might as well have been another continent. One of the guards noticed her staring and tipped his hat in greeting. She looked away quickly, cheeks burning with confusion. Inside the barracks, the air was cooler, shadowed by the wooden slats. Rows of bunks stood in perfect order, clean blankets folded at the foot of each bed. The women froze again. Even Mercy felt dangerous. Lotta sat down slowly, fingers tracing the rough grain of the bedpost. It was solid, real. For the first time in months, she wasn't standing in rubble or mud. The quiet pressed against her ears until she could hear her own heartbeat. Outside, the cowboys spoke to the guards, their voices blending with the soft rustle of the prairie wind. Lotta caught only fragments, the rise and fall of laughter that felt strangely human. One of them glanced through the open door, saw the women watching, and lifted his hat in salute. The gesture was small, almost casual, but it rippled through the room like a current. No one spoke, no one dared, but in that silence something shifted. It was the beginning of an unfamiliar kind of captivity, one that smelled not of smoke and fear, but of mesquite and earth. The land itself seemed to hum with contradiction. This was the enemy's country, yet it was beautiful. The guards wore guns but offered water. The fences enclosed them, yet beyond the wire was a sky so vast it made the soul ache. Lotta leaned against the bunk post and stared at the rectangle of light spilling through the doorway. She wondered, not for the last time, whether this strange land of dust and paradox might teach her something her own empire never had. That power could wear a smile, and mercy could be more disarming than war. At night, when the desert wind slipped through the slats of the barracks, Lotta would stare at the ceiling and remember the voices that had once shaped her world. She could still hear the training officer's voice, clipped and certain, echoing through the halls of the Reich's Auxiliary Academy. "If captured, you will not speak. If cornered, you will not surrender. The Americans are beasts in human skin." Those words had been gospel. They were repeated in films, whispered in dormitories, stamped into the marrow of every girl who put on the gray-green uniform. Surrender was shame, captivity, worse than death. They were told that Americans delighted in humiliation, that their prisoners would be stripped, starved, broken. Now, lying on a bed softer than any she had known in years, she could still hear that voice. But it no longer sounded like truth. It sounded like an echo in an empty hall. Each day brought new contradictions. The guards spoke politely, even when issuing orders. They called the women Miss or Ma'am in thick Southern accents that turned hard consonants into something almost musical. When one of the women fainted from heat, 2 soldiers carried her gently to the infirmary. There were no blows, no insults, only quiet efficiency. Lotta kept waiting for the cruelty to start, for the mask of civility to drop, revealing the monsters she had been warned about. But the days passed, and the mask never slipped. The Americans were ordinary. That was the most unsettling part of all. In Germany, kindness had become a rare and rationed thing. By the end of the war, it was as scarce as bread. Here, in the enemy's country, it appeared without reason. The first time they were given soap, the women handled it as if it were a sacred object, thick, white, faintly scented with something floral. Lotta rolled it between her palms, half afraid it would vanish. Back home, they had used ash and sand to scrub themselves raw. Now, hot water poured freely from pipes, steam clouding the room. When she stepped out, her skin flushed pink from warmth rather than cold. She could not stop trembling. It felt indecent somehow to be clean again. The next shock came with food, real meals, bread that did not crumble into dust, butter that melted on the tongue, potatoes glistening with oil. The mess hall smelled of coffee and bacon, and every time the scent drifted through the camp, a silence fell among the women. For many, it stirred hunger they had long buried. For others, it stirred guilt. Lotta often sat with her plate untouched for minutes before eating, imagining her mother at home boiling weeds for soup. She could not reconcile the two worlds, her family starving in the ruins of Dresden, while she, a prisoner, sat before abundance. At night, she wrote imaginary letters she would never send. "Mother, they treat us kindly, too kindly. They feed us well. I am ashamed to eat." Sometimes she folded the invisible paper and slipped it under her pillow, as though that act alone could bridge the distance between captivity and home. The women spoke of it in hushed tones. One said she could no longer remember the face of her commanding officer, but could recall exactly how the American cook smiled when he handed her bread. Another whispered that the guards were only pretending, that any day now the real punishment would begin. But no punishment came. Only the endless sun, the routine of work, the quiet decency of men who did not see them as enemies, only as responsibilities. For Lotta, the contradiction became unbearable. She had grown up under a flag that promised glory through suffering, honor through sacrifice. Now, surrounded by men who fought with courtesy and lived with abundance, she began to see how fragile that promise had been. Every gesture of civility chipped away at the armor of pride she had carried since the war began. When a young soldier offered her a second helping of stew and said, "Don't be shy, ma'am," she nearly wept, not because of the food, but because he spoke as though she still deserved to be spoken to kindly. In the long, hot afternoons, she would stand near the fence, watching the horizon blur into pale gold. Beyond it, cattle grazed lazily, tails flicking in rhythm. Freedom moved within sight, but stayed always out of reach. And yet, she thought, maybe freedom was not only the absence of wire, maybe it was something smaller, quieter, a courtesy offered when none was owed, a plate of food served without hatred. Still, when she closed her eyes, she saw the ruins of her city. She saw children picking through rubble for crusts of bread, saw her mother's thin hands stirring water into gray soup. The guilt came like a tide, unrelenting. How could captivity feel like relief when her homeland was starving? How could she sleep on a clean bed when her family slept beneath fallen beams? The shame was heavier than chains. It sat in her chest as the night deepened, the echoes of the Reich fading into the hum of Texas crickets. It was a strange kind of punishment, the punishment of realizing that the world she had been taught to hate was the first to show her mercy. The next morning, mercy arrived not as words, but as smoke, thick, curling smoke that drifted lazily above the wire fence, carrying a scent so rich it stopped the women mid-step. It was a Saturday, if the calendar in the barracks could be trusted, and the air already shimmered with heat. Beyond the fence, several men in Stetsons were stacking logs into a pit, their laughter breaking the silence like a foreign song. "Cowboys," the women whispered among themselves. "Ranchers from the nearby town." They had seen them before, lean men with sun-baked faces and easy grins, but never this close. Now they moved with the deliberate rhythm of people who knew how to make fire a friend, not a weapon. One poured water into a tin basin, another tuned a guitar. To the women, it looked like a ritual. To the Americans, it was simply a Saturday barbecue. The guard said little, only that the women should wash and gather near the mess yard after noon. Suspicion bloomed immediately. Some thought it must be punishment disguised as kindness. Others murmured that it might be propaganda for visiting officers. But when the hours passed and the smell of meat thickened in the air, salt, smoke, and spice mingling like a dream, they felt something far stranger than fear. They felt hunger sharpen into memory. The smell of roasting meat was almost unbearable. It reached through time and plucked at something soft inside them. For Lotte, it was her father's workshop she remembered, the evenings before the war, when he would bring home scraps of sausage wrapped in newspaper. They'd fry them on an iron pan, the sound of sizzle filling their kitchen. She could almost hear it now, carried on the Texas breeze. And for a moment she forgot the fence, the uniforms, the shame. Her hands trembled. The cowboys worked with unhurried grace, turning slabs of brisket over glowing coals, mopping them with sauce that glistened in the sunlight. The camp filled with sound, the rhythmic scrape of metal tongs, the low strum of guitar, the laughter of men who seemed untouched by war's fatigue. The women watched from behind the wire, torn between suspicion and awe. When one of the cowboys noticed them, he waved a hand and called out, "Don't just stand there, ladies. Supper's for everyone." The words rolled over them like a gust of warm wind. They looked to the guards for translation, and one of the soldiers chuckled. "They're inviting you," he said simply. "Dinner's yours, too." The sentence struck harder than any command. Invited, not ordered, not tolerated. Invited. The word itself felt dangerous. Still, under the glare of the Texas sun, they followed, step by cautious step, until the fence gate opened with a creak. On the other side, tables were laid with tin plates, pitchers of lemonade, and piles of bread. The smell of the fire was dizzying now. Fat dripping, coals hissing, smoke curling upward like a benediction. Lotte hesitated. Her instinct told her this was a trick, that no victor shared a meal with the conquered. Yet when a man in a dusty shirt handed her a plate heavy with meat and beans, smiling as though she were a neighbor, her resistance crumbled. She took it with both hands, too stunned to speak. The warmth of the plate seeped through her fingers, grounding her in a reality that made no sense. She lifted a bite to her lips, expecting bitterness, expecting the sting of mockery. Instead, the flavor was deep, tender, almost holy. Tears blurred her vision before she even knew they were coming. Around her, the others ate in silence at first, eyes down, posture stiff. But the cowboys didn't watch them like curiosities. They talked among themselves, played music, told jokes about cattle and weather. The laughter rose and mingled with the sound of crackling fire until even the prisoners began to soften. A few smiled shyly. One of the younger women tried to hum along to the tune, and a cowboy, noticing, grinned and nodded encouragement. Somewhere between the smoke and the sunset, the distance between captor and captive thinned to something fragile and human. The women were no longer symbols of a fallen empire, and the cowboys were no longer faceless enemies. They were simply people who had survived too much war and decided to share warmth instead of weapons. As we follow Lotte's story, caught between fear and warmth, take a moment to share where you're watching from in the comments below. It helps us see how far these stories travel. Don't forget to like this video and press the subscribe button just below, right under the video window. And if you tap the notification bell, you'll help us keep making more forgotten stories like this one, where history meets humanity. By the time the stars appeared, the plates were empty, and the women sat quietly, their stomachs full, but their hearts in turmoil. Lotte looked toward the fire, its embers glowing like small suns against the dark. The guitar still played softly. A tune she did not know but somehow understood. It was not a song of victory or loss. It was a song of being alive. She realized then that this meal, this absurd feast in a land of strangers, had changed something fundamental within her. The fire had not burned her enemy. It had burned away her certainty. And as she watched the smoke rise into the night sky, she felt for the first time that maybe kindness could be sharper than steel. When the last of the plates had been cleared and the air had cooled into that quiet stillness peculiar to the Texas night, the cowboys did not send the women back to their barracks. Instead, they threw another log on the fire, the flames leaping higher, scattering sparks that rose like tiny constellations. Someone brought out a harmonica, another a fiddle, and before long the night filled with sound. It wasn't the loud, triumphant music of soldiers or the regimented cadence of marches. It was something looser, unguarded, music meant for people, not nations. The tune wound its way through the crowd, brushing against the women like a soft wind. One of the older cowboys, a man with sun-leathered skin and a limp, began to speak between the songs. His English rolled thick and slow, like syrup poured from a tin. The guards translated where they could, though the meaning often carried itself through tone alone. He spoke of the ranch he'd left behind, of the drought that had nearly ruined it before the war, of his son who'd gone off to fight in Europe and never come back. He said it plain, without self-pity, as if grief were just another part of the land to be endured. The women listened, the crackle of the fire filling the spaces between words. Another cowboy, younger and sharper in voice, told a story about chasing cattle through a thunderstorm. The way he mimed the lightning and rolled his eyes at his own misfortune drew the first laughter from the prisoners, a soft, hesitant sound as if testing the air for punishment. But none came. The men only smiled wider, pleased that their stories had traveled across the fence of language. Lotte sat near the edge of the group, her hands clasped around a tin cup of coffee gone cold. The flames painted every face in gold and shadow. She found herself studying them, the rough hands, the easy posture, the faint lines around their eyes. They did not look like the monsters she had been told to fear. They looked like her father's neighbors, men who knew work, loss, and long silences. And when one of them spoke about the wife he left waiting back home, Lotte's throat tightened. She thought of her own mother, waiting still in a city that no longer existed. For the first time, the word enemy seemed absurd. The conversation flowed like the fire, slow, consuming, alive. One of the guards translated bits of the cowboys' talk about cattle drives and harvests, and though the words were foreign, the tone was universal. The women began to share small stories of their own, memories of childhood before the air raids, of brothers who had marched east and never returned, of fields that once smelled of wheat instead of ash. The cowboys listened with quiet respect, nodding as though these strangers from another continent were kin. Then the music began again. The fiddle took the lead, its voice bright and trembling, followed by the harmonica's low hum. The tune was old, older than the war, older than the fences that divided them. One of the younger women, unable to resist, began to hum along. The sound grew, cautious at first, then stronger. Before long, the camp was full of voices, German and English blending together under the stars. The music had no accent, no allegiance. Lotte closed her eyes and let it wash over her. It wasn't joy, not exactly, but something close, something cleaner. She felt the walls inside her, built by years of fear and propaganda, begin to soften. Around her, the women who had once flinched at every shouted order were now laughing softly, their faces open to the light. The cowboys clapped in rhythm, boots tapping against the dirt. The air smelled of smoke, coffee, and faint sweetness from the barbecue that still lingered. The fire popped, sending up a shower of sparks, and in that sound was a strange kind of peace. No speeches, no apologies, no declarations, just shared warmth in the dark. Lotta realized she was smiling, not because she had forgotten who she was, but because she had remembered what it felt like to be human. As the night deepened, the music slowed, drifting toward silence. One by one, the cowboys stood, stretching, nodding their farewells. "Good night, ladies," one called softly, tipping his hat. The women, almost instinctively, murmured their own good nights in accented English. When the last cowboy walked away and the fire burned low, Lotta looked around at her companions, faces once hardened by hunger and fear, now softened by laughter and the dim light of understanding. For the first time in years, she did not feel like a prisoner. She felt like a witness to something rare and fragile, something the war had tried and failed to destroy. The fire had become more than warmth. It had become a lesson, flickering between them, that even in captivity, compassion could still burn brighter than hate. That night, when the barracks lights dimmed and the whisper of crickets replaced the low strum of the fiddle, Lotta lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling. The scent of mesquite still clung to her hair, sweet and smoky, mingling with the faint odor of soap and dust. Her stomach was full, an unfamiliar heaviness that should have brought comfort, but instead brought shame. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness, the scent transformed. The smoke became potatoes boiling in her mother's kitchen, the air thick with the smell of broth stretched too thin. For a moment she was home again, until the image twisted, and the potatoes vanished, replaced by the char of brisket, the laughter of cowboys, the gleam of plates stacked with food. The dream soured. The warmth of the Texas night became the heat of Dresden burning. When dawn came, she sat up quietly, her heart clenched with guilt. The others were still sleeping, their breaths soft, steady. Some smiled in their dreams, perhaps remembering the music, perhaps remembering the taste of meat after so many years of hunger. Lotta envied them. For her, each kindness the Americans offered seemed to cut deeper than cruelty ever could. She had been raised to endure pain with pride, but no one had taught her how to accept mercy. In the weeks that followed, letters became the camp's only form of escape. The women were told they could write home, though few believed the words would ever find their way across the ocean of war. Lotta wrote anyway. "Mother," she began, her handwriting small and careful, "I am alive. I am treated well. The Americans feed us more than we need." She stopped there, pen trembling. What right did she have to describe the abundance when her mother likely starved in the ruins of their city? When she imagined the letter being read, perhaps intercepted by some officer in what was left of the Reich, her words felt obscene. She tore the page and began again, this time writing only, "I think of you each day. I hope you are warm." The rest she left unsaid. Weeks passed with no reply. Each morning the women lined up near the post table, waiting for the guard to call names. None were hers. When another prisoner received a letter, a scrap of paper smudged with soot and love, Lotta felt both relief and resentment. The silence from home became its own torment, louder than any punishment. She began to dream not of food, but of her mother's hands, raw from scrubbing, empty from want. The divide between comfort and conscience widened with each passing day. The camp's routine continued with impossible normalcy. Meals, chores, English lessons, music drifting from the radio. Yet under the calm surface, guilt festered. Each bite of bread was an act of betrayal, each kind gesture from a guard a reminder of her people's suffering. Lotta often found herself turning away from the mess hall, unable to eat, unable to explain why. "You must," another woman urged her once. "Starving will not help them." But the words rang hollow. Eating felt like forgetting. One evening, after roll call, a conversation broke out among the bunks. The women spoke softly, their voices cautious but trembling with emotion. "If they feed us like this," whispered a girl from Hamburg, "who really won?" The question hung in the air like smoke. No one answered. Lotta felt it settle into her chest, heavy as iron. The idea was unbearable that the enemy, in feeding them, had stolen not their dignity, but their narrative. They had come here believing themselves the defeated, yet in this strange, ordered captivity they were being shown a version of victory they could not comprehend, a victory measured in mercy. Later, as she lay awake again, Lotta traced the thought in her mind like a wound she couldn't stop touching. Her country had promised her greatness and delivered ashes. Her captors promised nothing and gave her food, music, warmth. Which promise, she wondered, held more power, the one made in glory or the one kept in silence? The night deepened, and a storm rolled across the plains. Rain hammered the roof, the sound raw and alive. For a fleeting second, it reminded her of the bombing raids, how the earth shook, how fire fell. She clutched her blanket and listened. But this storm brought no fire, no sirens, no screams. Only water, washing the dust from the camp, softening the world. The smell of smoke still lingered in her hair, faint but stubborn, like memory itself. And beneath the rhythm of the rain, one thought refused to fade. That perhaps the ghosts of home would never stop haunting her, not because she had left them behind, but because kindness had made their suffering impossible to forget. The rain cleared by morning, leaving the camp washed and glistening. The air smelled new, like dust reborn. The mud squelched underfoot as the women lined up for roll call, their uniforms damp, their hair clinging to their faces. Yet there was something lighter in the air, something almost resembling calm. Days had begun to fall into rhythm, each one folding into the next, their edges softening like worn cloth. There were chores to do, laundry to wash, gardens to tend, letters to write. Even laughter, quiet, uncertain laughter, began to thread its way through the barracks like the faint tune of a forgotten song. The Americans, perhaps without realizing it, had replaced their enemy's fear with routine, and routine with something more dangerous: normalcy. The camp, once foreign and severe, began to feel like a world unto itself. Lotta would wake each morning to the sound of boots crunching gravel and birds calling from beyond the wire. The sun rose over the wide Texas plains, painting everything gold. Inside the camp kitchen, the smell of coffee brewed by American cooks would mingle with the scent of baking bread. Sometimes, if she closed her eyes, she could pretend it was home, before the rubble, before the sirens. When the guards asked for volunteers to help in the kitchen, Lotta raised her hand. She told herself it was for the extra rations, but in truth, she was curious. The kitchen was a small world of its own, hot, noisy, and alive with movement. The American cooks, mostly young men barely older than the prisoners themselves, greeted her with nods and tired smiles. They spoke in a language she barely understood, but the rhythm of work transcended words. She watched how they marinated meat, how they kneaded dough with slow, practiced patience. Flour dusted her hands, soft as snow. The Americans used ingredients she had never seen: molasses, chili, cornbread. They showed her how to stir beans over a steady flame until they thickened and darkened. The food, they said, had to sit a while to find its flavor. She wondered if people were the same. Soon, more women joined the kitchen shifts, curious and cautious. Together they peeled potatoes, washed pots, learned the names of spices. The work, simple as it was, carried an intimacy that no guard could forbid. Once, an American handed Lotte a slice of cornbread, still warm from the oven. She hesitated, then took it. Its sweetness startled her. It tasted like sunlight, like something undeserved. "Good?" the soldier asked. She nodded, unable to form words. That single exchange stayed with her for days. In the evenings, the women gathered near the barracks steps, trading stories of what they had learned, how to bake, how to sew, how to string words of English together. Each discovery chipped away at the image of the enemy they had once feared. The Americans were not beasts, nor saints, but people bound by their own routines, their own contradictions. The realization unsettled Lotte more than any lecture could have. She began to understand that compassion itself was a weapon, quiet, invisible, but devastating. It disarmed without blood, conquered without command. Each act of kindness forced her to confront the truth that her old world had collapsed, not because it was defeated, but because it could no longer imagine mercy as strength. When the Americans offered her food, they were feeding more than her body. They were rewriting what power looked like. One afternoon, while scrubbing the last of the pans, Lotte looked through the open window and saw two soldiers sitting under a tree, passing a harmonica between them. One played a slow, lonely tune, while the other whittled at a stick. The sound was tender, human, unguarded. For a moment, she forgot which side of the wire she was on. That evening, when she returned to the barracks, she found one of the younger women crying quietly. "It's too easy to forget," the girl said. "To laugh, to eat. It feels like betrayal." Lotte sat beside her and said nothing for a long time. Outside, the crickets hummed. Finally, she whispered, "Maybe remembering isn't the same as refusing to live." The words surprised even her. They sounded strange in her own mouth, foreign, but true. And as the camp settled into silence, she realized that a revolution had already begun. Not of soldiers or nations, but of minds. It moved softly, like smoke after fire, impossible to contain. In the hearts of women who had come expecting cruelty, compassion had taken root, and once planted, it would never stop growing. It began, as many things did in that strange new world, with a letter. The Americans had announced that every prisoner would be allowed to write home, one page only, to assure their families they were alive. The news spread through the camp like wind across dry grass. For days, the women prepared in silence, gathering words as if they were scarce rations. Lotte watched them, the weight of her own unwritten thoughts pressing on her chest. When her turn came, she sat at a wooden desk under the watch of a young American sergeant and stared at the blank sheet. Outside, the Texas sun glared against the window, too bright, too unbroken. The sergeant handed her a fountain pen, nodded once, and looked away, giving her privacy that wasn't truly privacy at all. At first, her hand refused to move. She thought of the rules, the unspoken ones. She could not describe the camp, could not speak of guards, could not write of kindness. The Reich had forbidden such things, for words were as dangerous as weapons when they told the wrong truth. Yet what was the right truth? Lotte dipped the pen and began with what was safe. "Dear Mother, I am alive." The ink bled slightly on the paper, dark and certain. Her next words came slowly. "I am treated fairly. I am not hungry." Then she paused. "Fairly?" The word felt like a lie, not because it was untrue, but because it was insufficient. She wanted to write that they were fed, clothed, even respected, that the enemy had done what their own leaders had promised and failed to deliver. They had preserved dignity. Finally, against her better judgment, she wrote it. "The Americans are not as we were told." Her heart pounded as the words appeared, defiant and fragile. She could almost hear her old instructors' voices barking warnings. Never trust the enemy. Their smiles are masks. But Lotta had seen too much to believe that anymore. Their kindness had not been a mask. It had been a mirror. The letter, once finished, was short and careful, but it contained something dangerous. She folded it neatly and handed it to the sergeant, who glanced at her with a polite half-smile before placing it in the canvas mailbag. She thought no more of it, at least not that day. But weeks later, that single sheet of paper would travel farther than she could imagine, across the ocean, across a continent still in ruins, and into the hands of men who feared the truth more than defeat itself. In what remained of Germany's shattered administration, censors intercepted her letter along with hundreds of others. They had expected tales of starvation and brutality, proof that the Americans were monsters. Instead, they found words of astonishment, even gratitude. Letters spoke of hot showers, music, food, fair treatment. One woman had written, "The enemy gave me soap." Another confessed, "I am ashamed to be treated better as a prisoner than as a soldier of the Reich." The officials were furious. Some letters were destroyed, others were copied and studied like coded messages. But there was no code, only the unbearable simplicity of decency. Back in Texas, the women knew none of this. They continued their quiet routines, unaware that their words had become contraband truth. Lotta worked in the kitchen, humming under her breath as she scrubbed the counters. Sometimes she would glance toward the mailroom, wondering if her letter had reached home, or if it had vanished into the machinery of silence that ruled her country. She liked to imagine her mother reading it by candlelight, tracing the lines with her rough, work-worn fingers. At night, when the camp settled into stillness, she replayed the words in her mind. "The Americans are not as we were told." It was a confession and a prayer all at once. She hoped her mother would understand what she could not yet explain, that mercy could wound more deeply than hate, that kindness could shake the foundations of loyalty. In the weeks that followed, whispers began to ripple through the barracks. Letters had been stopped, someone said. Another claimed the Germans were calling the POW reports enemy lies. Yet the whispers only strengthened the quiet rebellion taking place inside them. For every word suppressed, a dozen more bloomed in memory. Each woman carried her own invisible letter now, a truth folded and hidden within her, waiting for a safer world to be read aloud. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Lotta stood by the fence and watched the sky turn crimson. A guard walked by, nodded, and said something cheerful she didn't understand. She smiled back anyway. The moment was small, but it felt monumental. Beyond the wire, the world was changing, and she could feel it, slowly, quietly, inevitably. She no longer prayed for release as she once had. She prayed only that, when the time came, her mother might believe her, that the enemy's kindness had undone her more completely than any victory ever could. It happened without warning, first as a whisper, then as a roar. Clouds gathered on the far edge of the Texas horizon, rolling over the plains like a gray army. By late afternoon, thunder cracked across the sky, a sound so deep it rattled the tin roofs of the barracks. The women looked up from their chores, shielding their eyes against the sudden change in light. For months, the land had been dry and pale, its grass brittle beneath their feet. Now the smell of ozone thickened in the air. Then came the first drop, a cool, fat bead of water that struck Lotta's cheek like a tear that wasn't hers. Within minutes, the heavens opened. The rain came hard and furious, washing the dust from the fences, the barracks, the very air itself. It pounded against the ground until the earth turned to mud. The women ran from their bunks without orders or permission, laughing and shouting in a dozen accents, their gray uniforms darkened with wetness, their hair plastered to their faces. The guards called after them, then stopped, realizing there was nothing to guard against. For the first time in years, no one was running for cover. Lotta lifted her hands to the sky, the rain streaming down her arms, soaking through the fabric that marked her as a prisoner. She didn't care. Around her, the camp transformed. The women were no longer prisoners or enemies. They were simply alive. They kicked off their shoes, their feet sinking into the cool mud, and began to dance. Some spun, others leapt, their laughter rising above the thunder like a song. One woman threw her head back and screamed into the storm, a sound so raw it silenced those near her. Then, just as suddenly, others joined in, a chorus of defiance, joy, grief, and release. At the edge of the yard, the cowboys stood under the awning of the mess hall, watching. They didn't interrupt, didn't laugh. Their faces, weathered and unreadable, softened as they took in the sight. One of them, Tom, the youngest, removed his hat and held it to his chest. "Ain't that something?" he murmured, almost to himself. Another nodded. They had seen storms come and go, cattle scatter, rivers flood. But this was different. It wasn't just rain, it was resurrection. The downpour blurred everything. Barbed wire, uniforms, the invisible lines that had divided captor and captive. Even the guards' voices faded into the rhythm of the storm. The world had become one sound, one pulse of water and heart. Lotta's feet slipped in the mud, but she laughed, the sound foreign and new in her own throat. She thought of home, of her mother standing at a broken window watching a different kind of rain, ash falling from a bombed sky. How strange, she thought, that one rain could destroy and another could cleanse. When the storm began to ease, the women slowed. The air shimmered with the scent of wet earth and something electric, alive. The sky cracked open, a single beam of light breaking through the retreating clouds. Lotta raised her eyes and saw it glint off the fence. For a heartbeat, even the barbed wire looked beautiful, jeweled with droplets that caught the sun like glass. One of the women began to hum softly, a hymn, maybe, or something older. Others joined in until the sound became a prayer, without words. The cowboys stood still, heads bowed in instinctive reverence. For a moment, the camp felt like a church with no walls. The rain had washed away more than dust. It had rinsed fear from the corners of hearts that had forgotten what hope felt like. When the clouds finally drifted away, leaving behind puddles that mirrored the vast American sky, Lotta knelt and pressed her palms into the mud. She didn't know why, only that it felt right. "For them," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she meant the dead, her mother, or the life she had yet to rebuild. Around her, the others fell silent, their breaths sinking in the quiet aftermath. The cowboys turned to leave then, their boots squelching softly. One glanced back, his expression unreadable, before tipping his hat toward the women. It was a gesture small as a prayer, but it carried more meaning than any speech. As the camp settled back into calm, Lotta stayed kneeling, feeling the cool earth between her fingers. The rain had left the air clean, the sky vast and impossibly blue. And though she knew the war still haunted every shadow, for this single sacred moment peace felt real fragile, fleeting, but real. The peace did not last. Within weeks, rumors began to ripple through the camp, whispers that the war was over in every sense now, that transports were being prepared to send the prisoners home. The word home no longer carried the same weight it once did. For many of the women, home meant ruins, graves, and ghosts. Yet they packed their few belongings quietly, folding blankets that smelled faintly of soap and earth, tucking away small treasures. A pencil stub, a scrap of newspaper, a bar of American chocolate, saved for someone who might still be alive. The Cowboys came one last time to load supplies for the departing convoys. There were no speeches, no formal farewells, just nods, small smiles, and an awkward silence that spoke more than words ever could. When the day came, the women were herded onto trucks, their names checked against faded lists. The camp gates creaked open for the final time, and the convoy rolled down the dirt road toward the coast. Lotta turned in her seat, watching as the fences receded into the distance, the towers shrinking until they were nothing but thin lines against the horizon. She thought of the rain, the barbecue, the music, the strange kindness that had remade her understanding of war. She did not wave. Her heart ached too deeply for gesture. The voyage across the Atlantic was long and silent. The ship that carried them home was gray, its decks crowded with men and women whose faces all told the same story: disbelief, exhaustion, dread. The air smelled of salt and iron. At night, when the sea hissed against the hull, Lotta lay awake in her narrow bunk, the rhythm of the waves reminding her of the Texas winds. She missed the sound of crickets, the sight of stars unobscured by smoke. She had thought captivity was confinement, but now, adrift between two worlds, she began to wonder if freedom could be its own kind of prison. When the ship finally docked in Bremen, the women disembarked into a silence that felt heavier than any chain. Germany was unrecognizable. The city lay flattened, its streets lined with rubble and silence. The air carried the acrid scent of burnt wood and dust. Children with hollow faces watched the returning prisoners from doorways that led to nowhere. Lotta stepped carefully through the debris, clutching her blanket to her chest. It was still clean, still soft, absurdly out of place among the ruins. She found her mother in what had once been their neighborhood, now little more than a skeleton of walls and chimneys. The reunion was wordless at first. They clung to each other, trembling, tears cutting streaks through the grime on their cheeks. When at last they spoke, their voices were hoarse with disbelief. Her mother asked about the Americans. Had they been cruel? Had they starved her? Lotta hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't wound. How could she explain that the enemy had fed her, clothed her, taught her how to live again? That compassion had come not from her homeland, but from the hands she had been taught to fear? So she lied, gently. "It was not easy," she said, "but I am alive." Her mother nodded, satisfied, and looked away. In that silence, Lotta felt the full weight of her secret settle in her chest, a truth she could never speak aloud. Days turned into weeks. The country around her tried to rebuild, brick by brick, soul by soul. Yet the kindness she had known in Texas followed her like a ghost. When neighbors cursed the Americans, she stayed quiet. When her mother spoke of vengeance, she could only listen, her thoughts drifting back to the camp yard where rain had turned to laughter. Freedom, she discovered, was emptier than captivity. In America she had been confined, yet cared for, powerless, yet seen. Here, in the ruins of her own country, she was free, but invisible. The streets were filled with hungry faces, eyes that no longer believed in anything. She wanted to tell them that mercy could exist even in war, that humanity could survive its own destruction. But the words would not come. No one would understand. Each night, she unrolled her American blanket and lay beneath it, the fabric smelling faintly of smoke and soap. She closed her eyes and imagined the wide Texas sky, the cowboys' laughter, the sound of rain against tin, the hum of distant crickets. The memory felt more like home than the city that had birthed her. Sometimes she dreamed of returning, of walking once more through the gates of that strange camp where kindness had felt like heresy. But she knew that was impossible. The world had shifted too far to ever return to what it was. And yet, in the quiet of those ruined nights, she whispered one final truth to herself, a truth that neither her mother nor her country could ever know, that captivity under the enemy's sun had taught her more about freedom than victory ever could. Decades later, the same sun rose over Texas, older, softer, its heat tempered by time. The land had changed, but not its scent. The mesquite still burned in the wind, the dust still clung to boots and fences, and the horizon still stretched wider than memory itself. A single car followed the dirt road toward what had once been a prisoner-of-war camp. Inside sat an old woman with silver hair pinned neatly beneath a hat, her hands resting in her lap. Lotta had crossed the ocean once more, not as a prisoner this time, but as a ghost retracing the steps of her youth. The radio hummed softly with country music as she approached the ranch. She rolled down the window, and the smell of smoke, sweet, sharp, unmistakable, filled the air. It was as if time had folded, carrying her back to the days when laughter had mingled with fire and fear. The old camp was gone now, its fences long dismantled, its barracks reclaimed by the prairie. Only a stone memorial remained, modest and sun-bleached, standing near a grove of oak trees. A bronze plaque read simply, "In memory of the prisoners who worked this land and the men who watched over them." No sides, no flags, no hierarchy, just memory, stripped bare of politics. Lotta stepped out of the car slowly, her knees stiff, but her gait steady. The wind tugged at her scarf. For a moment she stood still, listening to the whisper of grass against stone, the quiet chorus of insects. It sounded exactly as it had on that first night of freedom, when she had watched the rain wash the camp clean. She knelt before the memorial and placed a small tin of Texas soil beside it. She had carried it with her all these years, a keepsake she had hidden from her family, from her country, even from herself. As she brushed her fingers over the inscription, she felt the warmth of the sun seep into her palms. The ground beneath her smelled of mesquite and memory. "Danke," she whispered, her voice trembling, "for everything I did not understand." Down the road, a barbecue pit still stood at the edge of a local ranch. A newer one, perhaps, but the smoke was the same. Drawn by instinct more than hunger, Lotta walked toward it. The pitmaster, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes, greeted her with a nod. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said. "Smells good, doesn't it?" She smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth quivering with something too deep for words. He handed her a paper plate with a small portion of brisket and beans. She took a seat at a wooden table shaded by an awning. The first bite stopped her breath. The flavor was fire and sweetness, the same balance she had tasted as a young woman under the enemy's sky. For a moment, the decades fell away. She saw faces, women laughing in the rain, cowboys tipping their hats, guards leaning on rifles with tired kindness. She heard the harmonica, the fiddle, the sizzle of meat over coals. The memory was so vivid it hurt. She blinked hard, and a tear traced the wrinkles of her cheek. The pitmaster, noticing, said nothing. He simply poured her a glass of iced tea and left her in peace. The afternoon drifted by, the light turning honey gold. Lotta stayed seated long after the meal was finished, watching the smoke curl upward into the vast, forgiving sky. The world had changed so many times since those days, wars ending and beginning, borders shifting, truths rewritten. But this one corner of Texas seemed untouched. Here, kindness had once conquered pride, and mercy had rewritten the meaning of victory. As the sun sank, she rose slowly, leaving her empty plate behind. Her reflection flickered faintly in the car window, a woman who had lived through empires, captivity, and silence. Yet in that reflection, she saw not loss, but clarity. The enemies of her youth had become her teachers, though they never knew it. Before driving away, she turned once more toward the open fields, her eyes tracing the horizon where smoke met light. "Sometimes," she murmured, her voice barely louder than the wind, "the enemy teaches you not how to die with honor, but how to live with it." The words lingered in the air long after her car disappeared down the dusty road, carried on the wind that smelled of mesquite, fire, and the faintest hint of forgiveness. And though the camp was gone, its embers still lived, burning quietly in the hearts of those who remembered, glowing with the impossible warmth of compassion that had once crossed a line no war could redraw.